So, finishing out our section on status organizing processes and expectation states. Your activity 5 is in the process of being graded. Most of you should have your grades back by now. If, because I'm recording this early, I might already be finished with them. But again, like I said in the previous lecture, is that the next 2 weeks are going to be super hectic for me, very, very busy. So I'm trying to get these done as quickly as possible so that that's out of the way. We don't have to worry about that for the time being. So hopefully by this time they'll be graded. But if not, they're in the process of being graded and they'll be finished shortly. Your quiz 5 is due Friday at 11:59 p.m. And make sure to complete the assigned reading and watch the supplementary videos. So, today we're going to discuss some of the um, ways in which expectation states theory could be applied, and some of the critiques in terms of its scope, conditions, and some of the issues with the theory in general. So, in general, expectation states theory research does not speak to the larger question of whether the theory can account for macro level phenomena such as gender inequality. But we have talked about it in terms of small group interactions, which again, it was specifically designed to answer questions about group processes, specifically the creation of status hierarchies within small groups. But it hasn't been shown in terms of macro level applicability. But some theorists and researchers believe that it does show promise, at least for further development. So, from an expectation states theory perspective, social inequality arises when members of one group are perceived to have greater statuses or status and prestige than members of another group, and how this might contribute to social change, or how we could potentially disrupt these status hierarchies based on certain characteristics, not all, but certain characteristics. How do we disrupt these processes on a small group level? And how might that influence more macro level patterns of inequality based on things like race, gender, religion, socioeconomic status, and so on? So, according to this theory, positive social change would involve the disruption of the formation of these status beliefs, thereby reducing the formation of status distinctions that drive inequality. So, as a quick refresher in this process, in terms of social change using expectation states theory and status characteristics theory, which again is under the broader umbrella of expectation states theory, distinction occurs when members of a group systematically perceive that some members have a structural advantage. So, again, this is coming from a more macro level perspective and maybe ways in which the theory can be adapted to answer more macro level questions. So, again, distinction occurs when members of a group systematically perceive that some members have a structural advantage. Systematic perceptions develop as individuals reinforce these beliefs in interactions with members of both high and low status groups. And by understanding how these beliefs form and lead to certain groups becoming marginalized, expectation based theory provides insight for breaking these patterns. So, like I just said, the how might we disrupt these processes on the small group level, and how might that influence more macro level patterns of inequality? How might this lead to social change if we found some way to disrupt these processes on the group level? So again, that's not necessarily saying that there's a way to completely end these processes on a group level. That's not really reasonable, but how might we disrupt them in terms of people being forming expectation states, and in certain levels of being afforded certain levels of status and opportunity within a group based on characteristics like race and gender and socioeconomic status. So, some critiques of expectation states theory. So, what we just covered is again just a kind of a brief look at some of the areas that show promise and ways in which expectation states theory can be broadened and applied to answer more macro level questions. But by and large, that's not really the focus of expectation states theory, again, because it was something that was created to answer very specific questions about these status processes that are occurring in small group settings. So, some of the critiques of expectation states theory. So, expectation states theory suggests that status cues create performance expectations, which lead to interaction inequalities. Critics argue that performance expectations could possibly be caused by neural impulses instead of cognitive processes. So, again, they say that performance expectations could be related more to neural processes, so relating to the nervous system, instead of cognitive processes. So, cognitive meaning like the mental processes of acquiring knowledge and understanding through thought, experience, and the senses, and do not necessarily serve as a mediator. So, some of the critics are coming from, um, you know, uh, studies of like cognition and different like neural processes, and they say that expectation states theory kind of takes for granted these processes and how they operate, which is something we'll elaborate on here in some of the other critiques. So, despite the large amount of research utilizing models of cognition and status stereotypes, they are subject to certain limitations that account for their failures to address important features of social cognition. Related to this issue related to this is the issue of how status stereotypes and status intervention techniques are conceptualized. So, what they're saying here is that despite this large amounts of research trying to utilize different models of cognition and status stereotypes, there are limitations to that account for their failures to address these important features of social cognition. And that's related to the first critique. So, how we're kind of taking for granted these cognitive and neural processes and glossing over them a bit and simplifying them. They see it as something that's a bit reductionist, and we're overlooking a lot of the important processes that are occurring outside of what expectation states theory can explain. So, one critique challenges the image of humans as uh, mechanistic or rationalistic information processors, which, by the way, this is something we'll cover a bit during the section on social exchange in terms of humans as mechanistic or rationalistic information processors. But specifically for expectation states theory, it challenges this image of humans being mechanistic, humans being rational beings, rational decision makers. And they say this is because humans typically use, in terms of problem solving, they typically use heuristics, make sloppy assumptions about the world, and are influenced in their thinking by emotional, motivational, and other factors. And many decision making processes are characterized by a limited amount of rationality. So, heuristics, for example, refers to a problem solving strategy that uses shortcuts to produce good enough solutions. It's a flexible technique for quick decisions, particularly when working with complex data like social information. It's an approximation, essentially. And so it allows, it reduces mental effort needed to make decision. It simplifies complex questions. And so what they're saying is how this theory views humans is that we're mechanistic, we're rational decision makers, we're weighing these different, status characteristics. And it's not necessarily saying that we're, doing these advanced like equations in our mind and trying to figure out why, the exact status hierarchy in a group, but it is assuming that we are rational decision makers. That's kind of a foundational assumption. But the critics of the theory say that this is just not how humans work because we tend to use heuristics, we make sloppy assumptions, we're influenced by our emotions, other motivations, and there's really a limited amount of what we conceive of as rationality in our decision making processes. Another critique suggests that expectation states theory does not adequately address different approaches to human cognitive processes, and this results in an overly narrow depiction of what cognition encompasses. So, for example, one study showed that humans tend to use heuristics under conditions of uncertainty that can produce erroneous judgments. And in another study, the researchers argue that much social interaction is mindless and involving less cognitive activity than is often assumed because people routinely follow scripts. So, again, to reduce that cognitive effort, we tend to like routine. We tend to not think about things more explicitly, and so what they're saying is that we've produced this overly narrow depiction of what cognition actually is. And so again, minimizing and taking for granted the actual like cognitive and neural processes that are occurring in these uh, in our evaluation of others. So, one major critique highlights expectation states theories limited scope conditions as status organizing processes occur in a broader range of settings than those defined by the scope conditions of expectation states theory. So, for example, the settings where individuals take socially important mental ability tests, such as the ACT, SAT, and GRE, which are all highly task oriented, but clearly lack that collaborative orientation. And so, going off of that critique, one study demonstrated that individuals randomly assigned to low status conditions in experiments scored lower on a test of mental ability than those assigned to high status conditions. They contend that any attempt to measure mental ability needs to account for the way that salient status processes actually interfere with test taking performance. And so again, this is one of the critiques is how expectation states theory has limited scope conditions and that they could potentially broaden the theory's applicability if they took out that the collectively oriented task groups, if they expanded beyond that. And we're just looking at, for example, like just a task orientation in terms of status. So being in a high or low status condition and what that might mean for um, something that is task oriented, but without that collective orientation. And so, one thing that in your last activity, I split up task orientation and collective orientation, which I think is good in terms of understanding the difference between the two, but then helping you better bring them together and how a group can be task oriented and collective oriented. That there are these two different dimensions to the scope conditions of the theory and what it intends to actually measure, and that it's not simply looking at task orientation, but also that collective orientation and how that collective orientation is really the at the heart of the theory. And so critics say, okay, if we took out that collective orientation, that dimension of it, we could just focus on task oriented situations and what that means or how that is influenced by being in that high status or low status condition. And that could really open up the theory to a much broader scope of applicability. But other than that, that is all for this section. Your quiz 5 is due Friday, and I hope you all have a great rest of your week. Thanks.